buckle up, everybody, because we are going deep today, deep into the life of James Campbell, a frontiersman living in 18th century Virginia.
A fascinating guy.
Oh, he is. And we've got a whole stack of sources to dig through.
A stack.
We do. Historical accounts, land records, tithable lists.
Tithable lists.
Yeah, those are basically tax records that tell us, who lived where and what they own. And we've even got a petition signed by James himself.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of like having a puzzle scattered across time,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to put the pieces together to figure out his journey.
And it is a journey. The thing that gets me right away is that before 1772, James Campbell is like a ghost. No records, nothing. Then bam, he appears on a tithable list living along the Greenbrier River.
Okay, so we're starting with a mystery.
We are.
It makes you wonder where he was before, right? Like what brought him to that specific place.
Exactly. And he's not alone. There are other names clustered around him. The Butchers, the Peppers, the Van Bebbers. These folks are more than just neighbors. They're like this tight-knit group. That's how they survived on the frontier.
So it's less about individual families and more about this interconnected web of support. Kind of like, I guess today, how we rely on close friends or chosen family when things get rough.
Yeah, precisely. And watch those family names because as we go on, you'll see their lives kind of move in sync, mirroring the bigger westward expansion that was happening back then, like a tiny version of American history unfolding.
I like that, a miniature history. Okay, so we've got James on the Greenbrier River, part of this close community. What's next?
Well, in March 1774, James gets 280 acres of land on Indian Creek. And this isn't just any land. It's a grant connected to the Loyal Land Company.
Hold up. Let's pause for a second, make sure everyone's with us. For those who don't know, what was the Loyal Land Company? How did these land grants even work?
Well, picture this. A company with a royal charter wants to get as many people as possible to move west, past the Blue Ridge Mountains. That's the Loyal Land Company. They had a huge chunk of land, 800,000 acres, given to them by the Virginia Council back in 1749. These land grants were their way of saying, hey, come settle here, make this land productive, and it's yours.
Ah, so it's like this huge real estate deal to push westward expansion.
Exactly.
And owning land, even back then, it meant more than just having a place to live. It meant power, stability, a future.
Yes. And for James Campbell, who appears out of nowhere in 1772, getting this land just 3 years later, it tells us he was ambitious, eager to make something of himself in this new territory.
That's a great point. Okay, so we've got James, the ambitious newcomer. Now he's a landowner thanks to the Loyal Land Company. But wait a minute, was 1774 a pretty chaotic year?
It was. 1774, Lord Dunmore's War. Settlers and Native American tribes, things boiled over, and folks on the frontier had to choose sides.
And it wasn't some far-off conflict either, right? This directly affected James and his community.
Absolutely. We see James and a likely relative, Thomas Campbell, fighting alongside Joseph Butcher. Remember those interconnected families in Captain James Robertson's company at the Battle of Point Pleasant. This battle, where the Ohio and Kanawha rivers meet, it was a big turning point in the war, and it kind of foreshadowed the even bigger fight that was coming, the American Revolution.
It's like, for someone like James, these historical events weren't just like something you read in a book. They were his everyday life, forcing him to make life or death choices.
That's it, exactly. And speaking of life and death, after this battle, we find James and those connected to him at Rye Cove Fort in 1777. Shows how constant the threat was and how important forts were out there, like little islands of safety.
It must have been so heavy living with that uncertainty, always on edge, such a different world.
It was. And if that wasn't enough, there's another mystery that pops up. In land records, there's someone called Widow Campbell.
Wait, Widow Campbell? Who is she? And is there any link to James?
We don't have much to go on, but records show Ann Campbell, the Widow Campbell, getting land on Shavers Creek, flows into the Powell River, based on a claim from 1776. It's a puzzle piece, all right. And the timing. Well, you got to wonder, could this be a wife who maybe died on their way west?
Yeah.
Or maybe a relative. The records don't tell us exactly what their relationship was.
Like every clue leads to more questions.
Right.
But before we get too lost in guessing, there's another military thing James was involved in, right? Takes him even deeper into the fight with Native American tribes.
You're thinking of the Cherokee Expedition, 1776, a major campaign. And here's something really interesting. A petition going around for a new county mentions that James couldn't sign because he was off fighting.
Wow. So we have this personal connection to a big historical event.
We do.
Makes you think about all those people whose names we don't know, caught up in these conflicts, their stories lost to time.
Yeah.
What were these settlers hoping to achieve with this new county anyway?
Their petition tells us a lot about everyday struggles out there. They complained about how far and dangerous it was to get to the courthouse, 70 miles. Try settling a land dispute or filing a legal document with that hanging over your head.
Yikes.
They wanted a more local government, something that worked for their remote, often dangerous location.
It's amazing how these little details, like the distance to a courthouse, can reveal so much about how different life was back then.
Absolutely. And guess what? The settlers got their wish. Washington County, Virginia is formed in December 1776.
Wow.
And by 1783, James is getting land on the Powell River. Interestingly, Anne Campbell, our mysterious widow Campbell, also gets land around this time.
Huh.
Seems their paths keep crossing, adding to the mystery of their connection.
It's like a historical soap opera.
It is. New county, more land, the widow Campbell story continues. What else can we find out about James during this time? Things seem to be settling down a bit, but I bet there's more to the story.
I bet there is too.
You'd be right. Yeah, James was establishing himself, but frontier life. Rarely peaceful. Tragedy hits in 1782. Joshua Butcher Sr. and Jr. and Elisha Pepper, all dead. We don't know for sure why, but given the time, probably Indian attacks.
Oh, no.
Remember, those interconnected families. These losses would have been huge for everyone, a reminder of how fragile life was out there.
It's true, they built these lives for themselves, but danger was never far away. And speaking of those families, didn't something big happen in James's personal life around then? Something that shows how resilient and resourceful these frontier folks were?
You got it. The records, they don't have an official marriage certificate, but they point strongly to James marrying Catherine Butcher, Joshua Butcher Sr.'s widow, around 1782.
That's so interesting. So it's not just a marriage, it's families merging, resources being pooled, a way to cope with loss.
Yeah, and the land records support it. A grant from February 1782 shows Catherine getting land under the name Butcher, but later she sells that same land as Catherine Campbell. These little transactions give us a peek into how complex their lives were.
It makes you realize history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people making choices, building relationships, and doing their best in tough situations. It sounds like James is stepping into a new role now, not just landowner and soldier, but husband, maybe even stepfather. But remember those county lines that keep changing? They're about to become a big part of James's story.
You're right. Get ready for another twist. In 1786, Russell County is formed from the bottom part of Washington County. And this change has a big impact on James Campbell and his growing family.
Okay, I'm listening. What does this new county mean for James? New opportunities, new problems.
Let's just say it puts him in a position of power and leadership. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive into the life and times of James Campbell. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our journey through the life of James Campbell. Last time we left off with the new county, Russell County had just been formed, changing the landscape.
Yeah, reshaping things for folks living there.
Right. And remember how he'd proven himself as a soldier, landowner?
Yeah.
Well, this new county, formed in 1786, it needed leaders. And wouldn't you know it, in 1787, James is appointed captain of the Powell Valley militia in Russell County. That's not just a title.
No, it's not.
It tells you something about his standing in the community.
It does.
So he's not just surviving out there, he's becoming a pillar of the frontier.
He is. It's fascinating to think how his leadership maybe developed over time. Was he always a natural leader? Or did those tough frontier times forge those skills? Makes you wonder how much our environment shapes who we become.
It does make you wonder, and it makes me wonder, too, about those family connections we've been tracing. We've heard about Thomas, Samuel, Hugh Campbell, but what about children for James himself? Did he have a family of his own amidst all this?
Oh, you're asking the right questions. And this is where things get interesting. Around 1787, a James Campbell II, most likely James's son, shows up from Maryland.
Ah, a new generation joins the story. What can you tell us about this James Campbell II? Did he follow in his father's footsteps?
Well, let's just say he had a little bit of a rebellious streak. We don't have a ton of details about his life, but there are some, shall we say, interesting legal issues he runs into in 1789.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What kind of trouble did young James get into? Nothing too serious, I hope.
He was ordered to appear in the Russell County Court because he didn't list his taxable property, which you can imagine didn't go over well with the authorities.
Oh.
And to add a little color to the story, he was also brought up on charges for retailing spirituous liquors without a license.
Oh, dear. Sounds like young James was enjoying the frontier lifestyle a bit too much.
It might have been.
But legal troubles aside, I'm curious about how the larger Campbell family was doing during this time. We talked about them heading into Kentucky following that well-worn pass of the Wilderness Road. Did they find what they were looking for? That success and stability in this new land?
You know, it's complicated like history often is. We know that some of the Campbells and their families, they did go to Kentucky, lured by the promise of good land, fresh starts. But as they spread out, it gets harder to track their exact movements. Records from back then, especially on a frontier that's always pushing further, they can be patchy, leaving us with glimpses, but not the whole picture.
It's like they vanish into that vastness, their individual stories just becoming part of this bigger westward expansion story.
That's a good way to put it.
But before we get too far into Kentucky, there's another development back in Virginia we need to talk about. Those shifting county lines, remember? Well, 1792, Lee County is born, carved from Russell County.
Right, and this isn't just some line on a map. It shows how settlements were changing, that westward push, and how communities had to adapt.
Makes me wonder, with this new Lee County, were any of James Campbell's family still in the area? Did this change affect them?
Oh, it did. Some had moved on to Kentucky, but others stayed in the new Lee County. And this is where those land records come in clutch. They help us track what happened to James Campbell's land after he died in 1790.
Okay, so we're talking inheritance, the passing down of property, continuing a family's legacy.
Exactly.
What do the records tell us about who got what?
We learn that James Campbell's heirs were his wife Catherine and his children, Elizabeth, William, Isaac, John, and James II. They inherited 2 pieces of land, 440 acres on the Powell River and 365 acres on Martins Creek.
That's a lot of land to divide up. What do we know about how it was split?
Well, each heir got a piece of both properties. The records show a bunch of transactions, how these lands were bought and sold between family members and other big families in the area, like the Butchers and the Ewings.
Sounds like a tangled web of deals. What can we learn from all this buying and selling?
A few things, actually. First, it shows that owning land wasn't a fixed thing. People were always buying, selling, trading, maybe because their needs changed, their finances, or maybe they wanted to consolidate their holdings in a specific area. It also shows how important family ties were. For example, Thomas Butcher, Catherine's son from her first marriage, he got land from his half-siblings through his mother's second marriage to James Campbell.
Wow, that's a great example of how family and business were all mixed up on the frontier, and it makes you wonder if there were arguments, tension coming from all this land changing hands.
You're not wrong to think that. Land was valuable, disputes over boundaries, inheritance, who owned what, they weren't uncommon. The records don't always tell us the full story, but I think it's safe to say not every deal went smoothly.
A good reminder that history isn't just neat and tidy facts. It's messy, complicated, full of drama. And speaking of drama, let's shift gears and talk about the women in these families. We've talked about Catherine Butcher Campbell, her resilience, but what about the others? What can we learn about their lives on the frontier?
That's so important. The lives of women on the frontier, they often get left out of the history books. But they were vital to how these communities survived and thrived. They ran households, raised children, looked after gardens and livestock, and often gave crucial support to their husbands and families.
Absolutely, and let's not forget, they did all this while facing constant threats, conflict, disease, and just the hardships of a world that was always changing around them.
That's right. It really makes you wonder what their stories would be if we could hear them directly.
It does, like they're whispering to us through the cracks of history, urging us to look beyond the official records and picture how full and complex their lives were. Speaking of picturing things, I think it's time we stepped back and looked at the bigger historical context of James Campbell's life and legacy. His story is amazing, but it also reflects the huge changes happening in 18th century America.
Right. You're right. We can't just focus on the individual. We got to see the bigger picture. Westward expansion, the conflicts with Native American tribes, the fight for independence from Britain, and the birth of a whole new nation. James Campbell lived through all that. And that's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of James Campbell. We've followed his path from the Greenbrier River to the Powell Valley, seen him go from this mysterious newcomer to a respected leader, and untangled that web of family connections that shaped his life. But as we wrap up his story, I think it's time to zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture.
I agree. James Campbell's life, it's fascinating on its own. But it becomes even more meaningful when we see it as kind of a tiny example of what was happening in America back then, the 1700s,
Yeah.
westward expansion, those ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes, the fight for independence from Britain, the birth of a new nation. It's all there.
So it's not just about one man's journey, it's about understanding how those individual experiences, well, how they reflect those huge historical forces.
That's exactly it. And what's really striking is that these massive events, they weren't just ideas to people like James Campbell. They shaped his everyday life, influenced his choices, forced him to adapt to a world that was always changing.
Yeah, it reminds you that history isn't just dates and battles in a textbook. It's about real people facing real challenges, making decisions that affect their families, their communities, and in the end, history itself.
Absolutely. And when we look at James Campbell's life that way, we see these themes that still resonate today. The importance of community, the resilience of people facing hardship, that constant struggle to balance your own ambitions with what's good for everyone.
I like how you put that, those timeless themes coming out of these specific historical details, like that petition for a new county we talked about. It highlights how tough it was to govern on the frontier. They weren't just complaining about a long trip. They were fighting for a system that actually worked for them in their unique situation.
That's a great observation. It shows that tension, between a central authority and wanting local control, a tension that's still around today, shaping our political debates. And it makes you think, how did James Campbell, as a leader, handle these complicated issues?
It does. Did he embrace a bigger government, resist it, try to find some middle ground? It's too bad the records don't tell us about those internal struggles, those motivations. But hey, maybe those unanswered questions are what makes studying history so interesting, right?
Right. They make us think critically, to fill in the blanks with what we do know, consider different points of view, and maybe by grappling with those complexities, we can understand those who came before us, the challenges they faced.
I think it also encourages empathy, To put yourself in James Campbell's shoes, imagine facing the unknown out on the frontier, the constant threat of conflict, having to make tough choices in a world that's changing so fast.
That's it. It pushes us to not just learn about the past, but connects with it personally. And maybe, just maybe, we can find some timeless wisdom that can help us in our own lives.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dives into the life and times of James Campbell, what are the big takeaways? What can we learn from his journey that still matters today?
For me, James Campbell's story, it shows that history is made up of all these individual journeys, each one playing a part in the bigger narrative, often in ways we can't fully grasp. It encourages us to look beyond the big events, the famous people, to appreciate the resilience, the adaptability, and, the interconnectedness of those who live through these times of huge change.
And to remember that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how those past experiences shape us now and in the future. Exploring these individual stories helps us see how complex the human experience is and how we became who we are today.
And maybe by understanding their stories, we can understand our own a little better.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and times of James Campbell. We hope you've enjoyed this trip through the past and that it's made you curious to explore all those hidden stories that are out there, just waiting to be discovered.